The United States hasn't lost a fighter jet to enemy fire in more than 20 years. Now, 2 American warplanes are down, including one confirmed to have been shot out of the sky over Iran, and a U.S. airman is still unaccounted for. All of this coming just hours after President Donald Trump claimed Iran's air defenses had been wiped out.
We've beaten and completely decimated Iran. They are decimated, both militarily and economically and in every other way. They have no anti-aircraft equipment. Their radar is 100% annihilated. We are unstoppable as a military force.
Donald Trump and his Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, have been making similar claims since the early days of this war. And let's explore that further with Jennifer Kavanagh. She is the Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, an American foreign policy think tank that advocates for diplomacy above military engagement. Jennifer, thank you for joining us. Donald Trump has been talking up the impact of the U.S. strikes on Iran, talking about the utter destruction of Iran's defenses. But in all of that, we've seen that a fighter jet has been shot down. It's not easy to shoot down a fighter jet, so has Washington been overstating things?
Well, I definitely think that the president and the Secretary of Defense have overstated the degree of air superiority that the United States has in this conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States hasn't inflicted significant damage on Iran's defensive and offensive military capabilities. They certainly have. But taking out all of Iran's air defenses and all of its missile launchers is a task that is really impossible to accomplish in this short a time period, no matter how many strikes the U.S. Executes. I think it is important to note, however, that the United States has flown about 13,000 combat flights in this war and has only lost now, I guess, 2 aircraft yesterday. So that's a pretty good rate of success. These types of things are difficult, but for an adversary to accomplish, shooting down a U.S. fighter jet, but not impossible. The F-15 and the A-10, these are aircraft that don't have stealth capabilities. So really, I'm more surprised that this hasn't happened sooner than that it happened yesterday.
I'm just wondering, I guess the idea of having this sort of air campaign would have been one that the White House and the Pentagon would have seen as something that would work, or at least the White House in particular, would have been seen as something that would work politically because it avoids boots on the ground. Are you saying this kind of strategy has worked so far?
Well, it depends what your goal is. Tactically, the United States has been very successful in taking out Iran's military capabilities, its Navy. It hasn't accomplished maybe as much as the Secretary of Defense and the President have stated, but they have inflicted significant damage. So tactically, they've had successes. But strategically, they haven't accomplished any of the goals that they've articulated to the extent that they have articulated strategic goals. We haven't seen any regime change. There's been no progress towards ending Iran's nuclear program. And certainly, it would be unfair to say that Iran has been decimated militarily or defanged in any sort of serious way. So at the tactical level, yes, this has been successful. At the strategic level, no. This has been a massive disaster for the United States. Even if the war ended today, it's accomplished almost nothing, hasn't made the United States safer, has been very expensive, and has expended significant amounts of U.S. military resources that could be preserved for other more serious crises in the future.
Let's go back to this incident of the plane that's been brought down. There are also risks facing the missing airman. Looking at it as a whole, this incident as a whole, do you see it as significantly damaging for Trump?
Well, for the political optics, yes. He had just finished, maybe 36 hours before, a speech saying that the United States had defeated Iran like no adversary had ever been defeated before, that the United States had complete air dominance. The Secretary of Defense had made similar statements, and then this happened. And this is a clear suggestion that maybe the success has been more limited than the president has suggested. Now, it's important to note that air superiority superiority doesn't mean no risk. It doesn't mean that there's no risk to your aircraft flying over adversary territory. There's always risk. But certainly this sort of flies in the face of the level of success that the president has suggested. And it is, it isn't a rare event. The United States hasn't operated in this type of combat environment for a long time. Even during Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States was operating in a very permissive environment. There was no adversary that could really shoot down U.S. fighter jets. The U.S. was able to operate helicopters, which are very vulnerable to adversary fire throughout most of those conflicts. So this is a new experience, having a U.S. fighter jet go down behind enemy lines for most of the American public. And so for that reason, it is politically damaging to the president in the sense that it really captures the American attention in a way that that a lot of incidents in the war won't.
Speaking of helicopters, there's a current rescue operation. We've seen images of the helicopters flying in Iran. That rescue operation is also a risky affair, involving more American personnel closer to the ground, possibly more on the ground in particular. Is that another potential banana skin?
I mean, it's definitely a risk. Combat search and rescue operations are among the riskiest operations that the U.S. military conducts, because in order to search for a missing airman, these aircraft have to fly low to the ground. They have to fly slow so they can see, and they are visible, from the ground for adversary forces. So it is very risky. And very difficult. They are, however, the people who execute these missions are some of the most highly trained military personnel that the United States has. And it is a principle of the United States military that they do not leave U.S. soldiers behind. They will make every effort to rescue the missing personnel until they think that there's no hope. So when the plane goes down, that becomes priority number one for the entire region. Like, the focus is no longer the other things. Everything else is less important than trying to find that soldier. And that's very different than how other militaries operate. If you look at sort of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, I think looking at this from Moscow's point of view, it must seem insane to allocate so much resource and take on so much additional risk to search for one soldier. But that is one of the principles of the U.S. military. Of
course, one of the incentives, or one of the reasons why they have to also act urgently, is because Iran too can capture the missing service personnel. What do you think that would provoke if that were to happen? What do you think that would provoke from Washington?
Well, obviously, it's something that's very undesirable in the sense that it would be a political win for Iran, and they could choose to exploit it to try to get additional leverage. It's, again, something that would pull at the heartstrings of the American public. It would become, something that, a viral moment, I think, that would really turn people either against the war or evoke their sympathies in a way that maybe hasn't occurred so far. Now, I don't know necessarily how it would change the White House's calculus. The basic principle of warfare is that President Trump has articulated since the beginning of this conflict, is that they expect casualties. So they expect that they will lose personnel. And no commander-in-chief can make wartime decisions based on a single soldier. That's sort of the unfortunate reality of this. And, we can hope that if the soldier is still alive and is captured, number one, they are trained to a high level to survive that type of really difficult situation, including under captivity. And number two, we can hope that Iran would stick to the Geneva Conventions and treat the prisoner of war in accordance with the standing laws of war.
I'm sure that a lot of Americans, at least who have a view of history, will look at previous scenarios where American personnel or even American citizens, even in Iran, have been held against their will. That would surely be a major public concern.
Yeah, of course. As I say that we can hope that the Geneva Conventions are observed. We should acknowledge that probably wouldn't happen in the sense that we've seen how U.S. Citizens and prisoners have been treated in Iran in the past. So that's obviously a concern. Also looming in the background here is that Secretary Hegseth has made some very significant and aggressive comments in terms of how the United States might treat its adversaries that could provoke Iran. And we've seen how the United States has treated the people they've deemed combatants in the boat strikes in the Caribbean. So, the U.S. has also set a dangerous precedent here, which is an additional risk that is at least something that I'm concerned about.
Right. Now, we've heard from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard making some big claims of their own, saying that they shot down a U.S. fighter jet using a new air defense system. Here's a quote in a video statement, the IRGC spokesman saying, "The enemy should know that we possess advanced air defense systems developed by the country's young and accomplished scientists, which are being unveiled one after another in real combat conditions. We will certainly achieve full control of our country's skies." What do you make of this claim by Iran that it's developed these new air defense systems? Is that credible?
It's hard to evaluate that claim. I do know that Iran has made significant improvements in its defenses since the 12-day war. I think that the IRGC was concerned and disturbed by how easily they were targeted during the 12-day war and invested significantly in their own defense capabilities and also sought help from countries like Russia and China. And so there's, we have some sources that suggest that they did acquire new air defense systems, including Chinese systems, the HQ-9, which is the most advanced are one of the most advanced Chinese air defense systems. So it's possible that these are new indigenously produced Iranian systems that are just coming online. Another hypothesis is that they received these Chinese systems and they're just now learning how to use them. Like, just receiving a system doesn't mean that you can operate it effectively. There can be a significant learning curve in terms of understanding how it works, understanding how to target. We saw that in Ukraine. That the Ukrainians have become much more proficient at using Patriot systems than they were earlier in the war. All militaries learn and adapt over the course of a conflict. So I think what you're seeing here is, number one, a combination of new technologies, and that could be indigenous, or it could be new Chinese or Russian systems that they're now learning how to use more effectively. It could also be updating of their tactics, a better understanding of how the U.S. military operates, and also a little bit here of overconfidence on the U.S. side. The President and the Secretary of Defense have been very clear that they now feel comfortable flying U.S. Combat missions right over adversary territory. They're no longer using what are called standoff weapons. Standoff weapons are ones that can be fired from far away. They're using stand-in weapons, which they can just drop right over the target. But that means that aircraft are more vulnerable, and perhaps they were a little bit overconfident in their sense that they could do this safely without any risk and lowered the level of precaution.
And on that note, I'm just wondering, what level of control do you think Iran still has over its skies, considering what we've seen in the recent days?
Well, it's hard to put a number on that, but it's important, I think, to underscore that Iran doesn't need to control its skies to complicate U.S. operations. All it needs to do is deny the United States the level of control it would like. And that's actually quite an easy task for a modern military. It just has to make flying over Iranian territory too risky and too dangerous for the United States to want to try. That's, again, what we've seen as a parallel in the Ukraine war, is that Ukraine may not have full control over its skies, but it's able to deny Russia control, which means that Russia can't fly combat missions directly over Kyiv. And that's really, I think, what the Iranians are trying to aim for here. It's not necessarily the ability to dominate their own skies or keep the United States out at all times, but simply to deny the U.S. the type of dominance it would like to be able to carry out these significant bombing operations right over Iranian territory, or to use like the slow aircraft, so the A-10 aircraft, which the United States has been trying to introduce more into its combat operations, is not a very survivable aircraft. But the U.S. has lots of them, and they're cheap. So the U.S. would like to rely on these. Iran's goal could simply be to make it too dangerous to rely on these older, less expensive systems to raise the costs of the war for the United States.
Jennifer Kavanagh, it's been great getting your insights. Jennifer Kavanagh from Defense Priorities, thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you.
And now that we've touched on the political implications, let's focus more on the military aspect of all of this. And for that, I'm joined by Lieutenant General David Deptula. He's Dean at Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and he's someone with a robust resume, both from a policy and strategic level, but also he's earned his stripes even as a combat pilot. It's good to have you with us, Lieutenant General. Let's talk about this, the downing of this plane and the missing American airman. And of course, there's the rescue operation to find the personnel. Just how risky is this from a military perspective?
Well, it's an excellent question. And what I would share with you is that combat search and rescue is one of the most time-sensitive and dangerous missions in warfare. The moment a crew member ejects, the clock starts. And the first steps are to establish the airman's location, authenticate that they are friendly, suppress the enemy threats in the area, and then get rescue forces in and out before the enemy can close in on them. It is inherently high risk because it forces the rescue operation to operate at lower altitudes, at lower speeds, and often in a much more predictable pattern than normal strike operations. So that makes the rescue helicopters and the support aircraft much more exposed to small arms fire, shoulder-fired missiles, and opportunist ground fire.
And I suppose with this specific case, because they're not, because most of the American operation has been from the air or from a distance, there would be even greater risk because there's so much attention on this specific incident.
Yeah, the particular location, I mean, obviously the Iranians know where the aircraft went down. They were on top of the wreckage very quickly, showing pictures of one of the ejection seats. And fortunately, we recovered very rapidly one of the pilots, but search operations are still ongoing to recover the second. But they know where the aircraft is, so they put people in place. And anyone that shows up from U.S. rescue forces are much likelier to be engaged in a very big firefight when we go in to get the second crew member.
Right. This F-15E jet doesn't have stealth capabilities. I'm just wondering, what exactly would it have been doing, deployed to do? Because I'm just wondering, was there a miscalculation with the Pentagon thinking they destroyed Iran's defenses and therefore could send such a plane?
Well, again, it's a very good question. Air superiority, which has been achieved, doesn't mean immunity or invulnerability. What it means is the ability to operate where and when you choose to do so without prohibitive interference. And the fact that these are the first aircraft, or this is the first aircraft loss over Iran after thousands of sorties and strikes over highly defended territory, says more about how effective U.S. air power is suppressing Iranian defenses than it does about any Iranian success. Now, the threat's still real, but it's limited, it's sporadic, and it's far less effective than expected historically in a campaign of this scale. Just to put this in perspective for your audience, in Operation Desert Storm, the coalition lost 42 aircraft over 43 days of combat. And that's just under one combat aircraft loss a day. So losing aircraft is serious, but it does not mean Iran has suddenly reversed the air campaign. It means Iran still has some surviving anti-aircraft capability, which is normal in war, but by historical standards, the attrition has still been exceptionally low.
Right. Let's touch more on that, Iran's capabilities to launch drones and missiles. And let's have a listen to what Donald Trump said about this earlier.
Their ability to launch missiles and drones is dramatically curtailed, and their weapons factories and rocket launchers are being blown to pieces. Very few of them left.
How credible would you say this is? How strong are Iran's missile launching capabilities?
The fact of the matter is that after a month of combat, there has been a significant reduction in not just the ability of Iran to launch the same numbers and quantities that they were launching early on, but also their production capability. That said, Iran still retains meaningful threat missile launch capacity. It's being reported that U.S. intelligence has come to the conclusion that as of now, roughly half of Iran's missile launchers remain intact, and Tehran still has large numbers of one-way attack drones, which in reality are nothing more than cheap cruise missiles, but they're still available. So that means that Iran has lost a great deal, but not so much that it can no longer threaten Israel, the Gulf states, or U.S. facilities in the region.
But Iran, as you say, is still carrying out some of these attacks. Have you been surprised at how resilient it's been to U.S. and Israeli attacks?
No, actually, I don't think it's been resilient at all. I mean, I go back to the fact that after, almost 5 weeks of combat, they've only been able to shoot one combat aircraft down. That's not resilience. The fact of the matter is they produced thousands and thousands of these missiles. And so, they still have the ability to use them. And it's also why that this campaign needs to continue to completely eliminate or significantly reduce the point where Iran can continue to export its aggression. And that's part of the campaign objectives that have been stated by the administration. But here's what's going on. Really, to cut to the chase, what Iran is doing is they're playing for short-term gain, and they're sacrificing long-term considerations for their economy, their military, and frankly, their regime. They are betting that with an information sphere and media being so biased against the Trump administration politically, that they can use that as a means of perception management to create pressure on the U.S. To halt its operations. And what I would suggest to you is that would be a strategic mistake on the part of U.S., Israel, and the Arab Gulf states.
I mean, you say they're not resilient, but if we look back to last year, there was the sort of 12-day war where they were bombarded, and then you have, again, Israel and the U.S. talking in the thousands of hits on Iran, and they're still responding the way they are, hitting various targets across the Gulf. Surely that is resilience. Even the problems with the Strait of Hormuz and all of that still going on.
Well, I'm not going to argue about the definition of the word resilience, but what I'm going to tell you, in its reality, if you cut a nation like Iran's long-range missile and drone capability in half in 30 days, that's pretty significant. So let's see what happens in the next 30 days.
Well, I guess one would also argue that it's difficult to measure how much of this Iranian capability has been hit.
Yeah, you can argue about the specific numbers all day long. But, the fact of the matter is the intent of the operation was to put significant pressure, not pressure, but to essentially reduce Iran's ability to project power. And, I can go into the specifics in long-range missiles in against their Navy, against their Air Force, and then or against their production capacity, and then to prevent their ability to continue to continue their intentions to produce nuclear weapons. And so, one can argue about why this was started, but we are where we are. And the fact of the matter is, it needs to be continued until Iran no longer can project that kind of aggression, or they realize that they are going to be on the losing side of continued combat, and they come to that conclusion and agree to a ceasefire.
I just wanted to find out your assessment of what damage Iran has done, or how significant the damage Iran has inflicted on U.S. military assets in the region. For example, the radar facility hit at a U.S. base in Saudi Arabia. How could this affect U.S. military capability?
The impact is political and operational more than it is strategic. Operationally, those remaining launchers that we were just talking about allow Iran to keep forcing air defense expenditures on the part of the coalition, keep disrupting regional activity and imposing uncertainty. And politically, they allow Tehran to argue that it's still in the fight and to generate perception management pressure for a halt in U.S. operations. But that should not obscure the larger point. Preserving residual launch capacity does not mean Iran is winning. It means Iran is trying to trade remaining assets for time, headlines, and leverage. Now, look, there's still dangerous consequences to their launches, and that's why it's beneficial to see them continue being reduced, although they still continue. And the danger to American troops as well as the Arab nations in the region is real, and it shouldn't be minimalized. Iran's already shown it can hit U.S. and partner facilities. The destruction of one of the key air defense radars in Jordan was recently reported, and that's a pretty significant missile defense sensor. And then, you've read about the late March strike on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, which damaged some key U.S. aircraft. So the risk to U.S. personnel comes not only from direct casualties, but from degraded warning, tracking, and defensive capability at precisely the time Iran is trying to sustain pressure.
Right. Just wondering, Donald Trump, as we say, has claimed that the U.S. has total control of Iran's airspace. Would you agree that that's the case?
Well, again, there are definitions that the military uses to describe control of the air. And the United States and Israel does have air superiority over Iran. That's not air supremacy, where you can operate anywhere, anytime, without any interference. But essentially, it is the ability to operate in particular sectors at particular times where desired, without prohibitive interference. And in that respect, yes, the coalition forces have control of the air where they need it and where they want it.
And I'm just to wrap, I'm just wondering, considering how decentralized Iran's operation is, how do you see a military end shaping out?
Well, the military end is not necessarily what's as important as the strategic end. So operationally, the military has been performing magnificently, and the determination of when its objectives will be accomplished is a pretty objective assessment relative to the stated objectives. Long-range missiles, Air Force degradation, Navy degradation, and production capacity, and then the question of whether or not that they can continue their nuclear program. But the larger question is, okay, what about having the Iranians agree to halt their aggression in the region and establish a set of relationships that are much more aligned with peace and stability in the region as opposed to supporting terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Houthis, to get the Mideast to a position where we can achieve peace and stability. That's kind of the strategic objective. And when we get to that point, I have to tell you, it's much more than just a military solution. It's one that involves diplomacy, economics, and the integration of the regional states' perspectives as well. It's a much more complex issue than simply, what are the military end states.
Lieutenant General David Deptula, it's been an insightful conversation. Thank you very much for your time and your input. And we'd love to get your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to get your thoughts on this subject. And also, if you liked the video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe.